Did everyone sleep okay last night? No one was too depressed?
That box of allowable activism is sober.
Box, yeah. Any thoughts or comments people want to share before we get into today? I know a couple people have come up to me since they've walked in and said a few things, but anybody feel like sharing with the group?
Yeah, I like that. It kind of, after I left, it kind of made sense as a stuff right me this morning, connected to Marty. And I didn't, you know, when I taught social studies in high school when I grew up, they never taught anything like this way. But what made it personal is I had personal experience with corporations, how corporations fix law. In 2000, I had a car accident. Went through 18 months of physical therapy. In 2002, we had a settlement. So there were about 8,000 in medical bills. Right? The insurance company paid for them. But I had to pay the insurance company back that $8,000. And I'm going, wait a minute, this isn't about the medical, this is about me. And so I went up and started writing and talking and found out that they put in a law. The insurance companies did put in a law stating that if it's not your fault and they pay medicals, you have to pay them back if you get a settlement out of your settlement. And so I asked why. Why is that? This wasn't about the medical. I said, why do I got insurance for it? Wasn't that what that's supposed to be? So I'm asking this to my representatives in Olympia. And their only response was, over and over was, well, if we didn't put that in, the insurance company said they will walk. I said, let them walk. I mean, so 1 or 2 walks, who cares? So until you talked about that, then I kind of realized that, you know, how it affected me. That was $8,000 out of my pocket. I had to pay that to my insurance company that's supposed to take care of me. And it was not my fault. So that was just one incident of what you were talking about.
Okay. Thanks. Pam?
You were on the triangle and talking about the industries that make up the regulations. Is it just all of their input into the state agencies or federal agencies that make up? Is that where that comes from? Because I mean, literally, in my clear thinking, it would not be the industries that make it.
I can answer that because I worked for a corporation, 2 big corporations in California for a number of years.
Can you talk louder?
I'm sorry. I worked for a couple big corporations in California for a number of years. And I was one of those people that helped write stuff. I was a legislative analyst and advocate for a big retail company and a big oil company. And I don't want to say the rationale was because we were big donors, we had access. And that's one of the reasons we had access. And plus we belonged to trade associations that had a lot of power because we were a group of corporations that could wield a lot of power. And the rationale was that if we participated in the drafting of legislation and regulations and rules and policies, then we would be more likely to support them when they made their way through the lawmaking process. And that no one knew our businesses better than we did. Chemical company, we know more than much, so we would work with them to draft legislation that made sense relative to our business goals and objectives, what was possible for us to do on the ground. That is what the construct is that allows and encourages participation from business in the drafting of laws and regulations.
And it sometimes is even more sinister than that. One piece that Tom didn't tell in the
a short Pennsylvania story last evening was one of the prongs of the fight moved to the sludging corporations who were applying sewage sludge to farmland as fertilizer, and a number of local townships passed ordinances banning the application of sewage sludge as fertilizer. And so the sludging corporations got together with legislators in Harrisburg and helped write a state law, and actually in a session in the middle of the night passed a state law voiding all of those local ordinances, so that nobody's paying attention, nobody's awake. I mean, literally using all of the metaphors that we imagine, but that's actually what happened. That law also empowered the state attorney general to sue local municipalities to overturn their ordinances.
A lot of stuff.
But it was
happens
written by
really
the,
late.
it was written by the sludging corporations.
It's a sort of a war of attrition, almost like
Yeah.
the last guy standing gets, and the corporations have the money and the resources to put the criminal in those rooms, those late night sessions in the legislature where the deals are finally made.
Right.
And it also becomes easier because of, the box as well. So when you have all these other legal doctrines in play that really favor the corporate interests, really the pursuit of commerce and the property orientation of how the system of law works, it becomes easier then to put regulations in place, of course, that suit the industry itself. So it all kind of works together. This isn't disconnected from that rest of that box. It's really just an edge of that box. And then there's, of course, because people a lot of times like to focus on just the lobbying capability of corporations, which of course is a huge piece, and the money they have. But it's not just the lobbying capability and the money, it's the fact that they have all these other legal doctrines that make that possible. So it's not just one thing. I think that's part of what the school hopefully tries to show, is you can't just pull one thing away because there's 2 or 3 or 4 other things that are attached to it. So it's systemic. I mean, it's bigger than just the regulatory world or midnight regulations being put in place. It's the full system itself that is focused on something very different than I think most of the people around this table are focused on. And I'll show you a graph here in a little bit, which is really this tension between sort of the commercial commerce orientation and really fundamental rights, let's say, that there's this tension between the two things. And that's always been the case over time. This graph I'll show you here in a second, sort of, where does power sit, and are the decisions being made on behalf of sort of commerce and property, or are they being made on behalf of people's rights or even the rights of the environment, let's say, and how that has moved through our own history, and how there's been periods in our own history where we fought for greater rights recognitions against that sort of property orientation that the system's more set to want to value and protect and clothe in those legal doctrines, or allow these kinds of legislations which are really not about protecting the community or the environment, but making sure that the commercial pursuits move at the easiest means possible. So like in the oil and gas world, it's the oil and gas commissions at the state level that are the authorities of things in that extractive industry. And their main purview is to protect that resource, okay? And as efficiently and as productively pull that resource out and get it to market. And if there's environmental concerns, that's further down the line. So if you start to look deeper into all these various industries, you see about why they function the way they do, because of the way that the system is predisposed to want to favor that. And so we've always had these tensions about when that gets overboard and really starts to override, what people think to be just law or just government. We have moments where that clashes, like the Revolutionary period or the Civil War period and the Civil War amendments. We've had moments in our own history where that clash has come between sort of property and rights. What have people done in time around that? And that's a large part of today, is to figure out what happened in those moments of history as hopefully things that we might be able to apply today.
Although, okay, to be fair, one of the rationales obviously is jobs, economic development, for a community. That's always the countervailing argument, is that we will provide a greater tax base, with infrastructure improvements, jobs, and economic development for our community. So
Yeah, and I think the question that communities, or at least are asking now, at what expense, I think is the question. And who's deciding that economic future? And this is, what does a sustainable economy look like, for instance? And does it need to be the way it is today, which in large degree is unsustainable? So, yeah, I think the communities we work with are very clear that it's not about wiping out the capability of any sort of commerce, but what does that commerce actually look like? And is our system up to par to actually have a more sustainable existence economically, environmentally, socially, civilly, all that stuff.
Does the corporations have a very short sight about what is sustainable? I mean, their deal is, it's that plant manager on that site. Can he turn a profit with the constraints on him till he retires, until he gets transferred to, Houston or something? Just that year. I mean, the concept of long-term sustainability is not part of that culture.
So, and I think Jim might be able to speak to this, but like our agencies that we still have, the EPA and Department of Ecology, are you guys completely infused with all of
Captured?
Captured, yes.
No, we're not captured. One of the tensions we haven't talked about yet here is there's this, modern society, there's this body of professionalism, and professional standards. So what I saw in ecology was a lot of conflict between the scientists and the science and the lobbyists who are sitting in on the writing of regulations. So yes, they are definitely sitting in, they are participating. And there's this constant fight about how much authority the agency has to implement legislation. So the real battle was lost, I think, at the legislative phase. If you want to talk about the battle between, let's say, an environmental good and the commerce aspect of the environmental regulation, that battle is lost at the legislative phase. And there's this constant battle to restrict the ability of the organization that's supposed to implement the law to implement it. Water rights is a really good example. In the state of Washington, the Department of Ecology is supposed to adjudicate rights to water. Who has how much water? The funding for that is $20 a permit.
A permit?
Per permit, $20 per permit to do all the research. But the requirement for adjudicating the water right is that you have to research all uses of that property and that water over the last 100 years to determine who has senior water rights. There's a lot of water rights that aren't assigned senior status yet. So when we are asked to adjudicate a water right, because of the legislative priority of the commercial water purveyors, they made sure that the reimbursement for the process is only $20. $20. So basically it's a paperwork fee. And yet we spend thousands of dollars doing research, which is why there are now a backlog of something like 3,000 water permit requests. So it's that kind of, it's not so much that you're captured as that you're hamstrung, I guess I'd say. Hamstrung by the legislative deals that are made before the legislature hands you a bill and says, okay, turn this into a program.
Thank you.
And then the propaganda machine blames the agency for
Oh, yeah.
not being expeditious about running the research.
Yeah.
I just want to throw this in as an English teacher. I like images to make things more connective for students, and so that's why I like the triangle and the box. But I'll also add this because, in a very real sense, if you remember the final second to last scene, I suppose, of The Wizard of Oz, where Toto pulls back the curtain. It's the goal of that machine behind the curtain, and think about the way the wizard is pulling madly at multiple levers that we can't even see. The goal of the machine is that we look at the flaming head. And you look at the flaming head and it's democracy, it's the hope for real change. That's what we're distracted by when what's behind the curtain is the reality. And just one more example of the triangle. I mean, think about what's been happening at Standing Rock before the camps were raided on Wednesday. What I kept reading for weeks until the decision to raid the camps on Wednesday, make sure you lobby the Army Corps of Engineers to do the right environmental impact statement, right? Not about tribal sovereignty, not about the purity of water, not about climate, not about the real issues which are at stake, but if you focus on that single point, then we can win. And an environmental impact statement is just about regulating the damage. How much will you allow the natural world to be destroyed? And that's not the question we want to engage, right? That's exactly what happened at Standing Rock. And, you know, as I said last night, take out the issue, put in another one. It's always the same.
Anything, thoughts, any other comments before we kind of?
I have a question.
Yep.
Box, could you remind me, I've forgotten, what was Dillon's rule?
Remind you what now?
Dillon's rule down there, what's that?
Yeah, we're going to get into more today, but Dillon's rule is basically a legal opinion written by a judge talking about the relationship between state government and local government. And making the determination that the state really is in control. In essence, the state dictates down to the local. So power is given by the state, but power can also be taken away by the state. And so if you're a community, for instance, trying to do something of which a corporate interest is trying to cite in your community, and you try to make a law, for instance, against that particular activity because you don't find it to be sustainable or just or whatever it is you're looking at.
Or whatever.
Yeah, you know, Dillon's rule will come into play that says, well, you don't have the authority at the local level under Dillon's rule to make such a law. And so, I mean, he even went so far as to say that there's no need to elect local elected officials, that the local's merely an administrative arm of the state, so that our local communities are merely just extensions of the state government. Which can rattle some people's brains because there's this idea that somehow we're self-governing, self-determining people and our communities have power to make decisions about our own future. But the way that a lot of the law looks at it is it very much limits the ability of localities. So even in land use, for instance, well, the land use stuff's set at the state and it dictates how much the local can do. Well, that all can be reconfigured at the state.
So we're really seeing that like play out in places like Michigan where
Yeah.
the governor sending the master to run Flint and.
Sure. Yeah.
When you say the state, what does that mean? Is it the governor, the legislature, the judicial, what is the state?
Well, the state legislator through state statute, state constitutional amendments, whatever it may be, but whatever the legal mandate is at the state level, they can reconfigure, for instance, that authority that the local may have. So if the local, for instance, has certain land use authority today under the land use laws, Growth Management Act, all that, well, that all can be reconfigured at the state level to begin to constrict what the local can make decisions on, for instance. The state has the power to override that decision-making process if it so sees fit. And the point being is it's really about, do we actually have self-governing power, or are we merely under the control of the state as to what we can and can't do? So it's really then about, where does authority lie under this current system? And under Dillon's rules interpretation, the local really is at the mercy of whatever the state wants it to do. So this is why even, in North Carolina about the bathroom laws or Alabama about minimum wage, well, the state can come in and use preemption, but it also can use, Dillon's rule to say, well, you've never been given that authority in the first place, so therefore you can't even act in there. Or it could be more explicit and pass a preemptive law that says you clearly don't have power over it. So it's just, the box is meant to show that there's various ways that our ability to be self-determining, self-decision makers, local control type, how that's constricted by these various legal doctrines that have been built over the centuries.
So if you look at the box, as you're trying to imagine it in 3 dimensions and, being compressing from all sides, also if you think about the image of the whack-a-mole game, now add to that a soundtrack, because every one of those sides which press in, or the hammers that come at your head, are saying, you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that. That's what it's designed to do to local communities. But you can't do that, but you can't do that. And then we start internalizing it ourselves when you try and organize around a piece of local lawmaking which challenges one or more of those, and then we tell each other, but we can't do that, but we can't do that, but they won't let us. And so we colonize ourselves in the process.
Rebecca and Tim, do you guys want to quickly, you guys came in late, I don't know if you want to just introduce yourselves real quickly to the group.
Hi, I'm Tim Frothingham.
We missed everybody.
What?
Well, we missed everybody.
We missed everybody. Sorry we were late last night.
Yeah.
I'm just interested in this, local contractor, and interested in learning more.
I'm Rebecca Mack, and I would like to hear from, if we have a second, people just give a quick.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if everyone, but if a couple people want to just throw out to Tim and Rebecca about why they're here at the school so they can hear, that would be great.
Sorry we were late, we got lost on the campus. I work, we own rental property. Tim and I are married, and we own rental property, and I work at the community building downtown. And I do community advocacy, like that Main Street project in front of the community building was something that I worked on for 2 years with the city of Spokane to try to get them to agree to allow that middle of the street angled parking. If any of you have experienced it, it's different than anything in the city. And I do Airbnb, and I also work with the city for a couple of years. I'm trying to enact short-term rental legislation with the city of Spokane to allow those sorts of uses in residential areas. And I have a long background in corporate America as well, from many years ago.
All right. Former life.
Hmm?
Former life.
In my former life, that's right.
Anybody want to share why they're here quickly, and then we'll get into the day? Dina?
I got arrested in late August for, I think we stopped 11 coal and oil trains.
Oh, you're one of those people.
I'm one of them, and
On the track.
I figured I better know my stuff.
Sound like that kind of girl. You got the cart before the horse, didn't you? Yeah.
So you saw.
Somebody said, oh, it looked like fun.
So
No.
you saw the defense term in the name of that title of this organization.
Anthony?
Hi, my name is Anthony, and I'm 25 years old, and I'm looking to try to find more ways to get involved and implement progressive priorities at the local, state, and federal level, particularly when it comes to two issues that I really care about. One is campaign finance, and the other is healthcare reform. I feel like our healthcare system is dysfunctional, that we need a single-payer Medicare for all system, everybody in, nobody out, with free choice of doctor and hospital. No more private health insurance companies, no more co-pays, deductibles, premiums. Single payer is the way to go, so that's what I'm here for.
Good, good.
All right. Anybody else? Maybe one more person want to? Yep.
Oh, sorry, did someone else want to talk? Anyway, back to what we were saying, I don't know if this is a naive question or not, but I'm just curious if anybody has ever tried to sue for our government calling itself a democracy when it's an oligarchy.
I don't know on that specific grounds, but there are beginning to be challenges to where authority lies within our governmental system, really on this foundation of the right of local community self-government, and can the federal government override that inherent right? So there's starting to be challenges against not just the corporations, but even federal government itself. In fact, in Spokane, Dina is part of a lawsuit of which a collection of people have now sued the federal government for violating the people's right to a healthy climate and the right of local community self-government. That by allowing the fossil fuel trains to come through and to contribute to climate change, that's a violation not only of climate, but of our ability here locally to say, well, we don't want that threat to our community, and you're violating also our right to be self-governing people in the city of Spokane. So there's, I think, a little bit of what you're getting at is starting to happen. Most of the cases, when it comes to who has more power, are really still levied between the communities and corporations, because they tend to be the ones that the communities run into. But of course, it's the corporations using our own governmental structure to get what they want, potentially against the will of the community. So I think that is the start of what's beginning to happen around, do we want a greater kind of democracy, or maybe do we want democracy at all? Because I think part of the question that seems to come out of the schools, have we ever had a democracy in the way that we think we've had? And if we haven't, and we want it, and we don't want to live within the corporate state structure, well, what are we going to do to change that? And I think that's really the end of today, is for you guys to chew on what that looks like. We'll give you examples of what's happening in other places, but I think it starts to get at your question in a worded differently, but similar way. All right, so last night, just to quickly review, we kind of entered on sort of the doorway of this regulatory world. You know, what does that look like in the sense of who's writing the regulations? What does our activism look within that particular world? You know, what has been the sort of the outcomes of working kind of in that regulatory frame? Brought up, of course, the triangle and the box as ways to sort of visualize what that has looked like, both in the lawmaking and our own activism. And then we talked a little bit about how language has come into play around how things have been shaped, even around lawmaking itself, with the piece that Brad went over around the biosolids, sewage sludge kind of transformation. And of course, there's lots of other examples we could look at in that regard. And then we started to get into sort of the buildings of the colonial period and what was sort of the mandates that were put out through the authorities at the time. The papal bull with the Pope putting out sort of world domination on paper, and then how that has transferred into the conquest of lots of places like Africa and the Caribbean and India at the time of the height of that type of colonialization. And then how that form of lawmaking, basically, which became really English common law, began to be replicated, and how they utilized that same structure wherever that mindset landed. So that doctrine of discovery, for instance, in North America and other places, how writing it down, making it law, not only rationalized it, but also gave them another type of weapon beyond the actual weapons that were being used to suppress people who, of course, didn't have that worldview, didn't subscribe to that body of law. And that's really where we'll pick up again a little bit today, is people looking at how the system is structured, who's recognized under it and who's not. So in essence, who is legally recognized, who has rights and who doesn't. And when collections of people, a lot of times large collections of people, aren't recognized by the system that they have to abide by, well, we've had periods in our history globally here in North America as well as in other places where people have had to take that to account. So we'll have a piece here shortly by Brad about the levelers and the diggers in England, which is about 100 years before the Revolutionary period, bringing up this question about rights and the purpose of government and who's recognized and who's not recognized. And so, again, these tensions between who controls and who doesn't, and what the purpose of government really is for, and who is it benefiting. So, you mentioned earlier, who does government benefit? And I think that's kind of the question about what other peoples have had to ask themselves during different times of history. We didn't show this yesterday, but as another way to kind of view the roadmap of Democracy School is this other XY axis chart, so to continue our geometry lesson.
Is that in the book here?
That is not in the book. Feel free to take a picture if you got a picture. I can take a picture and send it around however you want. So the basic structure here is there's a timeline, historical timeline on the bottom. We've been kind of in this era of the 1600s or so, and we're going to move to today. This is indicating really sort of the purpose or really the function of how government has structured itself. In essence, what comes out of that form of government. And the further you're up on this scale, the more centralized, privatized, and preemptive government tends to be. And that usually means that government is put into very few hands versus more decentralized and democratized, let's say. So we've had periods of history, for instance, under English common law, where it was very centralized, very much about privatization. So we're going to talk about like the East India Company, for instance, which was the world's largest corporation, had a larger standing army than the British even. It was really about privatizing wherever they were, in essence, the commodities they took out, the resources they took out. And then using preemptive power. So we talked yesterday about the regulatory system, but for a very long time now using law or other means to basically preempt other views, other people's authority around wherever they may have been. And so you see over time this reconcentration of power when that's been pushed back on. So for instance, we're still a little bit in section B within the curriculum, moving to this sort of English common law colonization period. And then you're going to see, we're going to get into the revolution of America, the American Revolution. It was really a pushback on this centralized, privatized, preemptive kind of governmental structure to something that was more decentralized, self-governing, self-determining. And that's really been also about pushing back from this high sense of property protection or commerce protection towards something that recognizes rights. So we're going to dig into the Declaration of Independence, for instance, was very much about rights and whose rights were being recognized or not being recognized. And is government really just if it's not really recognizing the rights of the people, for instance? But then you'll see when we start talking about the Constitution that we see this reconcentration of power that starts to move back to the centralization, privatization, and preemption type of system. And we'll talk a little bit how that came to be and the mindset around why that was in the formulation of that document. And then in our own history, we start to see this pushback from that again around the abolitionists and the suffragists, again, people who were supposed to live under that system, but were not recognized basically as people under the system, in large degree, property. And so people were saying, well, wait a second, how can government be legitimate if it's not recognizing my rights? Why would I subscribe or see that as a legitimate form of governance if I'm not even recognized under that? And so the movements of abolition and suffrage are really about trying to recognize greater rights against really this high property orientation. So a lot of people have dubbed this period as the Second American Revolution. But the idea was that somehow we were going to reformulate our Constitution really to be a more rights-based document and less of this property commerce-oriented document. But as we've seen, there was then now this reconcentration of power back again. All right, this is really the evolution of the corporate state. So Thomas talked about last night, how did corporations began to be seen within the Constitution? Well, it started in the 1800s and has just been accumulating power ever since, so that the corporations have all these constitutional powers in large degree because of how the Constitution itself has been set up. And so we see this movement again back towards centralization, privatization, and preemption on really this protection of property and commerce over that of rights. And then this dashed arrow is really saying, well, where do we sit today, and will we get away from, again, the system we have today towards something else? And I think it's an unknown because we're in the midst of it, I think, and whether it's successful or not, we don't know. We know where the suffragists and the abolitionists ended up. We know where the American revolutionaries ended up in their pushback against how government was structured. The question is, if we feel we are living in a corporate state, how do we not live in that type of system, I think, is yet to be seen if we get there. And then nature is shown here as sort of this flat line. As I mentioned maybe a couple times yesterday, nature has never had rights under our system of government. Nature's always been property. And what we've begun to see over the last 10 or so years in the work we've been doing as communities actually moving a different form of law forward that actually recognizes the rights of ecosystems. So for those who've maybe followed indigenous views, well, that's kind of a no-brainer. It's always been understood that people are part of nature, not separate from it. We have to take care of what takes care of us. But the way that the legal structure has functioned, that's not been the case. And so you have about 36 communities now in the United States that actually legally recognize nature's rights. You have one country that federally recognizes it in their constitution. So
Denmark?
Ecuador.
Ecuador. So you're starting to see other places, whether it's communities, other countries, starting to understand that the legal system is not sufficient to protecting our planet in the way that it views it today in the sense of property, and actually moving this idea that we have to recognize those other beings that we're a part of from a rights-based standpoint. And so that's also beginning to happen in sort of this dashed line period of the timeline.
Has there been an evolution, and I'm bothered by this nature thing as a flat line. Has there been I think there has, but I don't know what your read on it is, an evolution in the notion of who has a property right in nature. It used to be only those who owned property had a right. Now you see a lot of lawsuits filed, for instance, over air pollution and water pollution that says, you're violating my right to clean water, you're violating my right to clean air as an individual citizen. So that's kind of...
Well, it's a human right. So I think
it's a human right, but it's a human right that infers a property right in nature, right?
Sure.
In the natural world.
So again, that's the tension we're getting to with what community is saying, well, it's one thing to protect human rights, but what about the ecosystems themselves outside of human impact or human benefit? I think that's the paradigm that communities are starting to challenge others with. And keep in mind, just like the rest of this work emanating from rural central Pennsylvania, so has the rights of nature, believe it or not. So little townships in Pennsylvania are moving this new viewpoint of nature in the way that the law was functioning.
Have it inherited.
Yeah, which is eventually what affected Ecuador to do what they did. So it's kind of, you never know if someone steps forward to actually start to push something, what can happen. And really the parallels in some ways are really back to the abolitionists and the suffragists, because you had, living entities that were not seen as having rights. They were seen as property. They were rightless under the system of government. And how that had to transform itself such that, living beings were eventually seen under our system as having rights. And that's very much what is beginning to happen now around nature itself. So again, we just use it as a means to kind of, again, chart our course through the school, but also just to give it our sense of how really the system has worked in the sense of who has power and who doesn't. And there's also a reason that this thing is escalating higher, because the system of this greater centralization has found a way to gain more and more power over time, because we have yet to actually, as Thomas described it, dig out the cancer deep enough. And so even though there were great strides made by the abolitionists and the suffragists, it didn't go deep enough in the sense of the ordering of government and where power and authority sits, which is why the system has basically been able to strengthen itself over time. That's the reason why it's kind of on that angle escalating upward.
What are the states, and some of the states and communities that recognize?
What's that question?
She was asking about which communities are recognizing nature's rights in law. So there's communities in Pennsylvania, communities in Ohio, communities in New Hampshire, New Mexico. Even though their law eventually got challenged, they had also sort of ensconced in their local law this idea of the natural systems having rights, and that was our duty to protect the rights of those ecosystems. All right, so we're going to start on page
75.
75.
And so we're going to go back into the time of powerful men in powdered wigs for a few minutes. And as I mentioned last night, the order of the curriculum materials in your book is different than the way that Kai and I have ordered it thematically. So I apologize for the jumping around in advance. This is one of the couple of pieces that we refer to by Thomas Paine. And what's important here is to pull back to last night's context of the papal bull. Even though it's not called a charter, the Pope is granting rights to Spain and Portugal like a charter. The Penn Charter, where King Charles II is saying to William Penn, here is what you get, all things discovered and yet to be discovered, and all things whatsoever. The same sort of charter granting that happens when the state charters a corporation. So think about what the word charter has meant historically. I'm guessing that one of the things we did learn about in junior high and high school history civics classes was Thomas Paine. And so this is but this is not a reading that I ever remember reading from Thomas Paine, because his commentary, it's a little bit out of chronological order, because then we go back to the 1600s, and this is Thomas Paine writing in the 1700s, but thematically I think it works. So on 75 is the title page of the book Common Sense, Rights of Man, Other Essential Writings of Thomas Paine, and a very short excerpt on page 76. And it's a specific commentary on corporate charters. So even though the Penn Charter was not a corporate charter per se, that's the way that Paine sees it, same way the Papal Bull was in effect a corporate charter. And I'm going to read not all of it, but a decent chunk of it. He says, I answer not to falsehood or abuse, but proceed to the defects of the English government. I begin with charters and corporations. It is a perversion of terms to say that a charter gives rights. So if you remember the way the wording of the Penn Charter goes, and the Penn Charter was just one of many that was kind of boilerplate. They were all like granting of rights and land from somebody arbitrarily deciding I have the power to do it, to somebody arbitrarily receiving those rights, powers. Paine says it is a perversion of terms to say that a charter gives rights. It operates by a contrary effect, that of taking rights away. Rights are inherently in all the inhabitants, but charters, by annulling those rights in the majority, leave the right by exclusion in the hands of a few. We're going to skip about 6 lines and go to the third line up from the bottom. He says, therefore, all charters have no other than an indirect negative operation. They do not give rights to A, but they make a difference in favor of A by taking away the rights of B. So think about, I think Rebecca, you said last night, what about the ecosystems, the inhabitants of the lands that in what became Pennsylvania, right? No consultation, no consideration of the rights that they have. Payne says those rights are taken away and consequently are instruments of injustice.
What year was this, Brad?
I don't know when Payne wrote this one. I'll look that up and I'll find that for you. Earl.
Payne was a fairly noted pamphleteer, wasn't he?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
How many people subscribed to his opinions? How popular was his outlook?
I think, I don't know if you know this.
Yeah, I mean, Common Sense was extremely
Yeah, Common
popular.
Sense was very widespread.
I mean, a lot of people subscribed that it was one of the kind of catalysts to the revolution itself. So that mindset of what's the purpose of governments, where do rights sit, fundamental rights, it had a huge impact on kind of the thinking and eventually the actions that came to play. I mean, eventually he was shunned, but at that time of Common Sense, it was a very popular and very influential writings that actually formulated that revolutionary period of thinking.
1776.
Okay, thank you.
When this was written?
Yes.
Wow.
And this is one more piece of the flipping back and forth, for which we apologize, but the next piece we're going to look at goes back about 130 years into the 1640s, about the Levelers, a faction during the 2 British Civil Wars. It starts on page 43, but on the facing page 42 is another piece of Payne's writing it's from the Complete Writings of Thomas Paine, where he's commenting on the corruption of the British Parliament. There's a reference there, an excerpt from a poem by Daniel Defoe about the House of Lords. As Kai said last night, these were the soldiers who fought for William the Conqueror and then were given land as a reward, and they became lords. If you just look at a couple of lines near the bottom, Payne says, the crimes of housebreaking, highway robbing, horse stealing, and robbing of churches. These are not bandits on the highways. This is what the lords did. So at the very base of all that they were precursors to the robber barons. And he says the House of Lords was originally composed of robbers, and the editor's comment is, this is aristocracy. If we go back 100 or 125 or so years, the excerpt is from a book called The Putney Debates, published in 2007. Just a little bit of history. This is a little bit of the perhaps spiritual emotional foundation of part of the revolutionary movement. In 1642, in the early 1600s, there was land that was judged to be common, and that which was not overseen by a lord and parceled out to serfs who worked for the lord was held in common, at least in theory, and it was called wastes. And a lot of landless peasants had access to work that land. Under the regimes in charge, the move was to privatize and enclose those commons. The Levelers were one of the factions of people who rose up in opposition to the Enclosure Acts. And just to give you an example, this is about that very diagram about how people push or pull back and the system snaps back. Envision this giant rubber band. When these factions rose up to say you can't do that, the Levelers were one. they then consolidate the power of enclosing. So there were different forms of enclosure acts all the way from 1604 to 1914. It began in the early 1600s. The levelers were a faction, an organized faction in prominence for about 10 years, 1642 to 1651. In 1801, one of the enclosure acts was passed by Parliament to kind of tidy up what had been missed in the previous iterations 200 years prior. Then, and this is exactly how the system works, in 1845, there was an act passed in Parliament saying that future enclosures that were deemed necessary could be done by enclosure commissioners without even resorting to an appeal to Parliament. So they passed a law enabling a hand-selected group of people to pass enclosures without even going through legislative means. So anybody who was left, who was landless and seeking common areas, that you can just see the consolidation of power over those 200 years.
It even got to the point where they made it illegal if you weren't associated to a piece of property. So if you didn't own it, you needed to be working it. So basically it was almost not even just a form of privatization, but a different kind of form of slavery, because if you weren't affiliated with the land as an individual and were found not to be affiliated with a piece of land that had been enclosed, they could lock you up. So it was very much not just about locking up the land, but also locking up individuals to work that land on behalf of those who controlled it.
So on page 44 and 45 is from a pamphlet, an excerpt from a pamphlet. To Earl's point about pamphleteering, the levelers became kind of pioneers in the use of petitions and pamphleteers that were put, broadsides put on buildings, on newsstands, for people to read. The levelers, they didn't like the name, but it became popular, and so they went with it. They had a fairly progressive vision at the time. They thought that suffrage should be extended to virtually all males. They still didn't include women. They wanted an end to debtors' prisons. All the servitude that went with being in debt, they wanted an end to that. They believed in natural rights as flowing from birth and not being conferred by the king or the aristocracy. They believed in equality before the law. And so they were opposed to the Enclosure Acts and wrote pamphleteers to raise support. They were never an organized political party per se, more like an informal cell, to use current parlance. There were other more radical forms of the movement. There was a group called the Diggers, who took their name literally from when the fences were put up to enclose what were these open field areas or wastes or commons. The diggers would literally dig them up. And so they were viewed as the more radical, and so there was factionalism and infighting because the diggers were the true levelers and the levelers were just sort of diggers light. I mean, you can imagine the infighting, right, between the factions. But this is from a pamphlet by a man named Richard Overton, who is kind of seen as one of the leaders of the levelers. And then we just want to highlight some of his language. So in that first full paragraph, notice it says this pamphlet appeared in July 1646 on London bookstalls. The title of it was A Remonstrance of Many Thousand Citizens. In the middle of that first paragraph, he's speaking to those in power, the king, parliament, those that Thomas Paine called corrupt and full of robbers. We are your principals and you are agents. It is a truth you cannot but acknowledge. As you listen to this language as the spiritual precursor to the American Revolution, the next thing we'll look at is one of the pamphlets written by the Sons of Liberty, those guys behind the Boston Tea Party, and you'll hear that language echo over the century in between. For if you or any other shall assume or exercise any power that is not derived from our trust and choice thereunto, that power is no less than usurpation and an oppression from which we expect to be freed, it being altogether inconsistent with the nature of just freedom, which you also very well understand. He then speaks of the history of our forefathers conquered by the Normans. We'll skip that paragraph, move down to the paragraph starting with page 3. For whatever our forefathers were, whatever they did or suffered, or were enforced to yield unto, we are the men of the present age, and ought to be absolutely free from all kinds of exorbitances, molestations, or arbitrary power. Now, think about this, because one of the ways that we're encouraged to be activists now is to send strongly worded emails to the right people, right? So you can also imagine the diggers saying, well, yeah, these are great words, but what are you going to do about it, because we're digging up fence posts, right? So imagine that conversation. But the language that Overton is using, what's believed to be Overton, is echoing 100 years later on the other side of the pond. Over on page 45, in that first full paragraph, what is this but to blind our eyes, that we should not know where our power is lodged, nor to whom to apply ourselves for the use thereof? But if we want a law, we must wait till the king and lord's assent. If an ordinance, then we must wait till the Lord's assent. Yet you, knowing their assent to be merely formal, as having no root in the choice of the people, from whom the power that is just must be derived, do frequently importune their assent, which implies a most gross absurdity. We desire you to free us from these abuses and their negative voices, power to veto or overturn laws, or else tell us that it is reasonable we should be slaves. This being a perpetual prejudice in our government, neither consulting with freedom nor safety. Free us from the abuses, or just come out and say, you are slaves, and that's the truth. Move down to the very bottom, that last full paragraph. You know the laws of this nation are unworthy of free people, and deserve from first to last to be considered and seriously debated, and reduced to an agreement with common equity and right reason, which ought to be the form and life of every government. Magna Carta itself being but a beggarly thing containing many marks of intolerable bondage, and the laws that have been made by parliaments have in very many particulars made our government much more oppressive and intolerable. And then the last line, you are not to reckon that you have any longer time to effect the great work we have entrusted to you. The rhetoric is strong and powerful and urgent. History says this didn't really change much, because the levelers by 1650, 1651, after the Second British Civil War, essentially went away. If you know a little bit about our own history, the agrarian revolt of the late 1800s began with similar beginnings. This way to pull back what was increasingly privatized and enclosed, largely at the behest of the railroad industry, began to build this massive movement throughout the Southwest and the South and the West. By the time the 1900s had come, the progressive movement had co-opted and made them disappear. Think about the history in which these people's movements have risen up for a short time, a longer time, and the way that that system actually says, that's not going to be tolerated, and we're going to pull it back. Sometimes under the guise of things that we would call progressive and democratic, all the ways in which the movements get colonized. As we move into the next piece, which is on page 109, again, apologies for the jumping around, the same kind of language that Overton is using is what we hear in the early revolutionary period, later I guess, 1773, from the Sons of Liberty in New York.
So we're in section C then on this graph. So this is that moving back away from, this attempt to move back away from that centralized, preemptive, privatized form of government to something more decentralized, something more based on rights. This is the section titled American Revolutionaries Rebel Against the English Structure of Law and Culture. And that piece on 109, as Brad mentioned, is a pamphlet put out by the Sons of Liberty of New York. That's the gentleman's name that this one's been credited to is Alexander McDougall. This was put out in 1773 and has a lot of similar language to Overton's piece from the Levelers 100 years previous. Though this one definitely points more towards the agents of government at that time. And of course, the biggest agent of the British government was the East India Company. So the corporation that was chartered by the king was really the one doing a lot of the work and the bidding of the king. But was very much about this combination of corporate power and governmental structure. And then again, where do the people sit under that particular system? So he raises a lot of the similar points as Overton did against the British government back in England 100 years previous, this now being on the soil of North America. So we're going to just look at a couple of things, again, around the language being used at that time, what was being pointed out regarding the kind of system that people were told that they had to live under. So at the top of 109, it starts there under the salutation, my dear fellow citizens. It was fully proved to you in my first number that the East India Company obtained their exclusive privilege of trade to the country by bribery and corruption. Wonder not then that the powers thus obtained at the expense of the national commerce should be used to the most tyrannical, cruel purposes. It is shocking to humanity to relate to the relentless barbarity practiced by the servants of that body on the helpless Asiatics, a barbarity scarce equaled even by the most brutal savages or Cortez the Mexican conqueror. So what he's doing here is beginning to set the scene about what the empire is doing in other places on the globe. So we heard about India, we heard about Africa, the Caribbean, and this is, again, a warning, an alarm towards where things may be headed if we don't get in the way of it, that we may be facing the same things that these other peoples are facing based on how the government is operating. And this very much leads in then to the Revolutionary period, the Declaration of Independence, the writings of Thomas Paine, all of that talking about what is the system, what should the system be, who is government really for, where are our rights recognized in that. And so McDougall's really pointing out, if we don't actually stand our ground and move on that, this is where we're headed if we're not paying attention. So in that middle of the paragraph, or middle of that page, 109, just to kind of put a finer point to what he meant by the type of physical abuse we may be seeing ourselves at some point if we don't do something about it. He writes here, those perished by this black, sordid, and cruel a farce, but they did not satisfy their more than insatiable thirst for their property of this miserable people. What the nominal Christians could not extort from these wretched mortals for the wants of their bellies, they determined to torture them from their pains of their backs. They were stripped naked and suspended to post, and in an excruciating condition, mastiffs and cats suspended by their tails were applied to the backs of their miserable victims until they gave such sums to these more than cruel tyrants as they were pleased to exact. So we talked about yesterday, the moves the British did in India to destabilize the whole system of life, to basically put it under British control, and in essence really starve people, and then if need be use physical force to move them under the system that they wanted to see happen, which is this colonial system, the English common law system, really the centralized, privatized, preemptive system, that those who were there or those who were going to be under that system would then have to live by it or become potentially victims of that system itself. And then flipping over to page 110, just getting to that last paragraph there. This supply impoverished the nation. The poverty of the nation by these corrupt means forced venal ministers to be regardless of the ways and means to support their creatures. And the creatures they're referring to, of course, are the corporations and those who are benefiting from this form of government against those who actually have to either give up to that system in the way that they have to be enslaved by it or potentially even with their lives. To support these creatures, the Stamp and Revenue Acts originated, acts pregnant with chains and the loss that is all dear to these colonies. So here you're seeing references to the legislative acts happening from the British government, putting these taxation measures on the colonies. So this is that taxation without representation that we may have remembered from history class. So he's making references to what is actually happening currently through legislative actions taken by the king and his agents on the ground to basically, squeeze the people of the colonies to benefit the corporations and those others that are the haves basically of this particular system. So will you, my countrymen, suffer these miscreants who ruin the Constitution at home to rivet the chains their wickedness has by the matchless means recounted forged for you? And then skipping a couple of lines to finish here, it says, the company's inequities, tea, must be sent to the colonies, the profit of which is to support the tyranny of the last in the East, enslave the West, and prepare us fit victims for the exercise of that sordid inhumanity that have in such dread abundance with more than savage cruelty practiced in the face of the sun on the helpless Asiatics. So obviously a very emotionally charged cry to get people to basically see what's going to be happening here. Perhaps obviously maybe a little over the top around what they may be seeing, but really much pointing out, if we let the system continue to be operating in this oppressive way, we shouldn't be surprised if we find ourselves suffering in the same way that other peoples have under this form of government. So again, like Overton during the period of the Levelers, you have people like McDougall through the Sons of Liberty, basically stirring the pot to say, can we continue to live under the system? And if not, what are we going to do about it? Which is really then, parts of what then contributed to things like the Declaration of Independence and again, eventually the Revolutionary War itself. And at the end of this particular section, we're going to walk through the first Constitution of the United States, which was the Articles of Confederation. And we use that to show what it looked like compared to what the second Constitution looked like, and why it was formulated the way it did. Very much comes out of what McDougall and others were saying about what is the purpose of government, who does it serve, and how does it need to be constructed to make sure it serves who it really should be serving versus how this type of English common law colonistic system operates today.
And you can kind of sense, at least I can, a change in the rhetoric from Overton to McDougall, because it moves from this strongly worded letter kind of thing to that last piece that Kai referred to, will you, my countrymen, suffer these miscreants? It moves toward a call to arms. And this is 2 years before the Boston Tea Party. And if you ask me 5 years after I left middle school, how did the American Revolution happen? Well, there were colonists and the British and the Boston Tea Party and then the Declaration of Independence and then the Revolutionary War. What happened after the Boston Tea Party? So imagine this diagram, in that one section, and where we're in section C, kind of blow that up, and you imagine the Boston Tea Party at this pulling back. Well, the Crown and Parliament said, we're not going to allow that. And they outlawed local self-government in Massachusetts. And then you move to the actions of the Declaration and the war. And so it's always this tension and the rhetoric of these pamphlets the Sons of Alarm wrote is much more militant, for lack of better words, than Overton. So you see this progression over time. We move next, no flipping around this time, the second visit with our friend Thomas Paine from the same book. This is from a pamphlet that he wrote in 1791. And so it's important to think about that historical perspective, because this is 15 years after the Declaration, after the Articles of Confederation have been ratified, then replaced by the Constitution 2 years later. And so it's kind of reflective for Paine to be writing about this. And his general thesis here is to talk about the way in which the Revolution signified that was happening in other places around the world, this new kind of government versus what was the old kind of government. And see as we read through this if you can hear some kind of subtle commentary about what has just emerged a couple years before. He says at the top, the independence of America, considered merely as a separation from England, would have been a matter but of little importance had it not been accompanied by a revolution in the principles and practice of governments. If it was simply about, we don't want to be Britain's colony, we want our own government, but it wasn't about, and the key word here is revolution, it would have been not important at all. He goes on to say the revolutions which formerly took place in the world had nothing in them that interested the bulk of mankind. They extended only to a change of persons and measures, but not of principles, and rose or fell among the common transactions of the moment. So he is prophetically rewriting the who's won't get fooled again, right? What's the line from the song? Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. So Paine is saying these revolutions that took place other places are just a matter of changing the boss, and nothing fundamentally is different at the bottom. This revolution was different. Skip the rest of that paragraph, move down to the third paragraph. Nothing can appear more contradictory than the principles on which the old governments began and the condition to which society, civilization, and commerce are capable of carrying mankind. Government on the old system is an assumption of power for the aggrandizement of itself. On the new, a delegation of power for the common benefit of society. Though it might be proved that the system of government now called the new is the most ancient in principle of all that have existed, being founded on the original inherent rights of man. Yet, as tyranny and the sword have suspended the exercise of those rights for many centuries past, it serves better the purpose of distinction to call it the new than to claim the right of calling it the old. This new thing we're instituting, so we're in section C, pulling that centralization, privatization, and preemption down to rights, is called the new. A delegation of power, back in that third paragraph, for the common benefit of society, not for the aggrandizement of itself, which is what Parliament, the Crown, represented. This revolution wasn't just, okay, now we're not British. This is about fundamentally changing the way government works. That's important when we look at the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation, because the thought was, it's not just, well, we don't like what the King and Parliament are making us do, so we want to make our own rules. We want to fundamentally shift the paradigm of how government works. That's important to keep in mind when we move from the Declaration to the first Constitution, and then how quickly, so we're talking about a couple of, just a decade or more, how it snaps back to get to the second Constitution, the one that we all grew up hearing angel choirs associated with.
So page 113, you have the Declaration of Independence. We're going to look at two things. We're going to look at the portions of the Declaration that perhaps we all know to some degree or another, and then we're going to look at the part of it that we may not have either been taught or spend a lot of time reading, but there's an important reason to look at that other piece of it. So on page 113, you have a copy of it there. It starts on 113 and finishes on 115. So in that left-hand column, can someone read for me, starting that second paragraph where it says we hold these truths? Would someone like to? Page 113, second paragraph, left-hand column, where it says we hold these truths to be self-evident.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness.
Stop there. So the portion that Rebecca just wrote about, for instance, the institute new government laying its, or actually, excuse me, before that, it says that whenever a form of any government becomes destructive of its ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Where else do you see that language today? Does anyone know? If you look at pretty much any state constitution, the first right in just about any state constitution echoes exactly this language from the Declaration of Independence. This idea that people are the all source of governmental power, and it's the responsibility, duty of the people, to alter, change, or abolish government if it's no longer doing what it should be doing on behalf of the people. So we see the Declaration, even though the Declaration itself doesn't live in the same way, let's say, the Constitution does. We see the elements of it living through things like state constitutions, and as that being a very founding principle, for instance, of the states themselves. What else do people remember when you hear the Declaration of Independence? I think that's probably the biggest piece. What else do people remember from your own research, from your own schooling? What else comes to mind when you hear about the Declaration of Independence? Obviously, it has its own holiday.
So, Thomas Paine wrote this.
Thomas Jefferson was the drafter. One thing, though, to keep in mind is, even though this is what we see as the Declaration of Independence, about 2 to 3 years prior to this, there are already communities declaring independence from the British government. So you had colonies even, you had communities that were declaring independence prior to even the formulation of this Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, prior to July 4th, 1776, there were 90 local declarations of independence throughout the colonies. So you have this local movement moving up to the collective, what became federal.
Besides it being kind of an interesting factoid, we bring it up also to show that, you know, when movements have built, where have they built from? Well, they've built from the local, that it's always been local collections of people, local communities who have pushed new paradigms forward. And it was no different during the revolutionary period itself, just as it was no different during suffrage, so just like it was no different in the civil rights movement, just like it's been no different for the gay rights movement. You know, it's all evolved from the local. And so even the Declaration of Independence, even though we may not have been taught that history, it really came from the culmination of individual communities stepping forward first before the collective did through the Continental Congress and this particular document in the Declaration of Independence that we know today. The other part of the Declaration, beyond that left-hand column, which sort of lays out sort of the purpose of government, this inherent rights of men, that all governing power really is in the people, which if you think about it is sort of a crazy notion to put forward, since most of the world was being ruled by kings at the time. So it was a monarchical power structure, or it had this oligarchy type structure of the House of Lords type system. But this idea of the people somehow having governing power was foolish. That's just crazy talk.
Just to insert, this is Article 1, Section 1 of the Washington State Constitution. All political power is inherent in the people, and governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed and are established to protect and maintain individual rights. That's Section 1. Section 2 says, the Constitution of the United States is the supreme law of the land. So you can see by the way it's written what is first and most important. And that's from the Declaration.
So the other part of the Declaration of Independence is really the listing out of grievances that the colonies had around how the system of government was functioning. And if you were to go through it all, which we won't hear today, but there's about 27 different grievances that they highlighted. And there's a couple that we're going to point to because they echo this idea of people wanting to be self-determining. So this idea of self-government was being put forward. You see elements like that, you know, components we'll see in the Articles of Confederation, as well as some of it even in the Constitution, this idea of military power, you know, this idea of standing armies in the colonies, that people had an aversion to this idea of military presence at the time when there was no need for military presence. And so this full list of these 27 different grievances is the other part really of what the Declaration of Independence lays out. So on page 113, the first one actually listed on that right-hand column towards the top, and this is you know, the Declaration talking to the king at the time, which was George III. And it says here, he has refused to assent to laws that most wholesome and necessary for the public good. So this idea that, you know, he keeps making laws to the benefit of him and his buddies, but what about the rest of us? That these laws are actually about oppressing our ability to be self-governing, interfering with our ability really to live as a functioning society and community, whether it was the Stamp Act or there's other taxation type acts going on, but, you know, asserting his power basically to override our ability to be lawmaking, self-governing people in our communities. Skipping down a little further, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, he reads here, he has dissolved representatives' houses repeatedly, proposing with manly firmness his invasion on the right of the people.
Opposing with manly firmness.
Skipping 3 more down, he has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his consent for laws for the establishing of judiciary powers. Skipping the next one and going to the one below that, he has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. One below that, he has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of the legislatures. Flipping over to 114, he is affected to render the military independent of and superior to civil power. Skipping a couple more, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. Just below that, for imposing taxes on us without our consent. Just below that, for depriving us of many cases of the benefits of trial by jury. So you start to see even things around the Bill of Rights, around individual rights coming out in this particular document that we see later in the Constitution. Skipping 2 more, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments. And skipping 2 more, he has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burned our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. So of that 27, if you really start to look at what is being said here, you can make the argument that 12 of those 27 really are about local control, self-determination, self-government. So this idea of local self-government is nothing new in the sense of what we're starting to see with communities today. It harkens back to this very period of time where people were no longer wanting to live or willing to live under this centralized form of government. They wanted a decentralized form of decision-making power, and felt that really government was in the hands of the people to decide, not the greatest economic powers to dictate against the people's will. And this is really what the Declaration and eventually the Revolutionary War was pushing back against. And this is just one of the documents that, of course, we see today when we look at that period, laying out what it is, not only in the context of getting, again, away from the British Empire, as Brad noted, but actually the willingness and desire to want to institute a new form of government, to get away from the old and actually start something new. I mean, that's why it was revolutionary. People were actually looking to go in a very different direction that they had been living under and others had been living under before them. And so that's what made it so important, which also makes it very interesting when we start to see in Section D, that we'll get to here in a little bit, why the Constitution was really a revolution against the revolution. And we'll explain what we mean by that when we get more deeply into that. The next piece is on page 117, again talking about what it meant to actually oppose the British Empire through things like the Declaration of Independence. I also need to remember that in certain communities, the people physically went in and removed the local governors of the British government and instituted their own government. So the people actually seized power before things like the actual fighting began. Basically displaced the British agents of the British Empire and actually put their own people in power to actually begin to practice what it is that they want to see, the self-governmental power. So there was a lot of things going on in that period of time. Whether it was about McDougall or Thomas Paine or the Declaration, or people actually in the communities where they were living, no longer willing to live under what they considered to be illegitimate system and actually acting out what it is they wanted to see beyond just the words on paper, and starting to self-govern themselves against the power and really the legal authority of the system that they were living under. So that's another big thing is, what they were doing was seen as illegal. And so in this next piece, we'll see, a kind of a fine point put on what it really meant to be revolutionary in this sense from that legal viewpoint.
So 2 things. One will probably make you sad. It makes me sad. And one is designed to make you laugh a little bit. In my experience, when I ask students if there's a reference to because one of the things that I teach as a junior English teacher is this curriculum about the American Dream. Earl and I were talking before about how George Carlin said the American Dream is called that because you have to be asleep to believe it. So yet I have to teach the American Dream. And so if there's a reference to the founding documents, if you talk about endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights and blah, 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 almost to a person, students don't know that's from the Declaration. They think it's from the Constitution. That's kind of how the information has morphed in the way we remember things, this DNA that Tom talked about last night. The second thing I'll just say is, Kai mentioned that the Declaration has its own holiday. And of course, if you think about the 4th of July, and there's a group in Spokane that I don't know how many years they've been doing it, Gather at Finch Arboretum. It was organized first by a man named Tom Westbrook, and now I think his son, what is his son's name? Mark has taken it over. People gather together, some dress in period costumes, and they reread the Declaration of Independence, or somebody recites it from memory. It's called Freedom at the Arboretum, so put it on your calendar for July 4th. But whatever celebration you're thinking about, you can probably imagine a certain soundtrack playing, right? So what would come up in your mind if you're thinking about the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July? What music?
The Star-Spangled
Star-Spangled Banner. Battle Hymn of the Republic. God Bless America, right? All those things, America the Beautiful, all those patriotic songs. This next piece, which is a book by Ralph Barton Perry with an introduction by Earl Latham, proposes, and I'm going to propose that next time you think about the Declaration, the song that's in your head be the theme from the Fox show Cops, Bad Boys. Because what he asserts is that when those 56 men put their names on the Declaration, they knew they were fundamentally breaking the law and could die for it. So this is not a small act. That the drafting and the signing of this declaration were overtly illegal acts of civil disobedience. So there's a couple of brief excerpts, starting on page 118. At the bottom, right below the break. On July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress, on the motion of Richard Henry Lee, adopted the following resolution: that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. The resolve and the act were unmistakably and uncompromisingly illegal. The Declaration of Independence, which was adopted 2 days later, was a philosophical creed designed to justify the action of men who had taken the law into their own hands. We don't think of these visionary people as criminals, as lawbreakers. But if you move back into the paradigm of the time, he's exactly right. Men who had taken the law, they knew that one of the possibilities was they could be executed. Their heads put on pikes, as example, to demonstrate to the rest of the colonies that this is what you happen when you mess with the powers of the empire. Very briefly, there's a mention at the bottom of page 119 that the Declaration was composed by Thomas Jefferson, owing as much to his intellect as well to his pen, One of the, and this is really complicated for me because the current sensation over the Broadway musical Hamilton, there's part of the back and forth is between Jefferson and Hamilton, and my kids love and know all the music. We're going to talk about Alexander Hamilton in about half an hour because it's a way more complicated picture, but the back and forth between Jefferson and Hamilton is I think pretty imaginatively done. One of the things that we don't include here, but is one of those things that you learn in junior high or high school, is the Patrick Henry statement, right? Where did Patrick Henry say, "Give me liberty or give me death"?
At the Virginia House of Burgesses?
In the Virginia House of Burgesses. So this is also one of those fun things I get to teach to juniors because they really care about this stuff. There's a persuasive speech unit, and Patrick Henry's speech is one of the examples we look at. And he's in the House of Burgesses, this is before the Declaration's been signed, trying to convince, this is after the Boston Tea Party, so militancy is on the rise, but he's there trying to convince the elected officials, remember elected by just a handful of property-owning men, but he's there to convince the elected officials that it's time to take up arms. That all of the signs have been mounting over the years, and it was only when he said, give me liberty or give me death, that he was able to move that legislative body to say, yes, we support the taking up of arms. So think about the way the colonization that Morris described last night makes us lethargic, makes us, well, we can't do that. Well, we shouldn't try that. Well, we should try getting more people at the demonstration. We should write more letters to Parliament, right? The other thing that I'll just add as a piece of context, I went last Monday night to the screening of the James Baldwin documentary, I Am Not Your Negro, and one of the things that Baldwin says is, when a white man says, give me liberty or give me death, we laud him as a hero. A black man says the exact same thing. What do we label him as? A criminal, and treat him as such. And so as we move into the first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and the second, that racial stain which has been on this country from the beginning will be subtly but still present. On July 9th, 1778, turn to page 121, the Articles of Confederation were drafted as the governing document of this new nation. And I'm going to read some sections of it, not all of it, because that would take too long. But as we look at these passages, I want you to kind of keep an eye out for what you notice that is there and what you notice that's not there. I don't remember, I'm sure it was taught to me by Mr. Yorman in 8th grade history at Glover Junior High. I don't remember being at all steeped in the Articles of Confederation. I remember learning the preamble and the Articles of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, but I don't remember, I'm sure it was there, but it's one of those things that you just kind of space out. And in democracy school, we call this the first Constitution, to distinguish it from the Declaration, which is a document of separation, a declaration of war, actually, and then the Articles of Confederation become the first governing document. Then, as we will see in the next few minutes, how quickly we move from that to being replaced by what we call the Second Constitution. So it's in 1778. The war is still happening. It's not yet over. And some of these are, and you notice, first of all, keep your thumb on page 121, but notice how short it is, especially in comparison to the Second Constitution. It's only about 4 pages long. Article 1, the style of this confederacy shall be the United States of America. Article 2, each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right, which is not by this confederation, expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. Article 3 describes the nature of this union. The said states hereby severally enter into a firm league of friendship with each other for their common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare, binding themselves to assist each other against all force offered to or attacks made upon them or any of them on account of religion, sovereignty, trade, any other pretense, whatever. Now, it's very key that we look at Article 4 and its subtlety. So you have in Paine's words this movement away from the conference of rights by the king, which came from God, to this extension of government on a new principle, which is about the benefit of society based in the natural rights that all people get when they're born. Yet, there are certain people that we don't want to include. And it's very subtly included here in Article 4, Section 1. The better to secure and perpetuate mutual friendship and intercourse among the people of the different states in this union, the free inhabitants of each of these states, paupers, vagabonds, and fugitives from justice accepted. Very subtly, what did that sentence just say?
Poor people need not apply.
And who doesn't count?
If you don't own land, you don't count.
It also allows for slavery.
You're not free.
Right? Not free. This is the free inhabitants. This allows for slavery. So we want to make a disclaimer here. We don't uphold the Articles as some inspired document that we should return to, because it is fundamentally flawed. It allowed and ensconced the institution of slavery. Did not challenge that whatsoever. But it's a different kind of governing document. So again, keep your eye and ear out for what do you notice that's there, what do you notice that's not there. If we skip down to Article 5, Section 1, for the more convenient management of the general interest of the United States, delegates shall be annually appointed in such manner as the legislature of each state shall direct, to meet in Congress on the first Monday in November every year, with a power reserved to each state to recall its delegates or any of them at any time within the year, and to send others in their stead for the remainder of the year. One of the things I want to have you think about is when we say United States or read it, it's always capitalized, both the U and the S. There are many ways in which this document is referring to United States lowercase. Think about the difference. Because the United States capitalized means the entity, the nation. If as I was thinking about this, if they're lowercase, it's a group of states which work in union, but don't always, this firm league of friendship. Over on page 122, we're on section 3. This is still Article 5. Each state shall maintain its own delegates in a meeting of the states, and while they act as members of the committees of those states. Section 5, freedom of speech and debate in Congress shall not be impeached or questioned in any court or place out of Congress, and the members of Congress shall be protected in their persons from arrests and imprisonments, etc. That talks about no state entering into any treaties without the consent of Congress assembled. If you skip down, we're now in Article 6, Section 4. No vessels of war shall be kept up in time of peace by any state, except such number only as shall be deemed necessary by the United States in Congress assembled. Nor shall any body of forces be kept up by any state in time of peace, except such number only as, in the judgment of the United States in Congress assembled, shall be deemed requisite to garrison the forts necessary for the defense of such state. Now we'll move over to page 124. We're now in Article 7, Section 5 at the bottom. The United States in Congress assembled shall have authority to appoint a committee to sit in the recess of Congress, to be denominated a committee of the states, and to consist of one delegate from each state, so 13 men, and to appoint such other committees and civil officers as may be necessary for managing the general affairs of the United States under their direction. On page 125, Section 6, still in Article 7, the United States in Congress assembled shall never engage in a war, nor grant letters of marque and reprisal in time of peace, nor enter into any treaties or alliances, nor coin money, nor regulate the value thereof, nor ascertain the sums and expenses necessary for the defense and welfare of the United States, or any of them, nor emit bills, nor borrow money on the credit of the United States, nor appropriate money, nor agree upon the number of vessels of war, etc., unless 9 states assent to the same, nor shall a question on any other point except for adjourning from day to day be determined, unless by the votes of the majority of the United States in Congress assembled. You see the phrase, United States in Congress assembled, over and over again. So in that case, you've got 9 of the 13 have to agree. I'll then call your attention to page 126, and you will see who signed the Articles of Confederation. From each state, there's 2 or 3 people from each of the 13 colonies. So that's the governing document, and I know that you didn't read the whole thing, unless you're one of those people who just love reading government documents. And you already know this from memory. What do you notice that's there, and what do you notice that's not there?
There's no individual right to bear arms.
There's no Second Amendment language. The right to keep and bear arms, well-regulated militia. What else is there or not there?
Discussion of religion.
There's no mention of religion, which appears in the First Amendment. There is a reference to freedom of speech and not being impeached or abridged. What else is there or not there?
There's no delicate balancing of members of representatives and
There's no mathematical calculus about proportionality, right? It's delegates per colony, and then when the Congress is in recess, there's one per colony to manage the affairs.
So Virginia and Rhode Island are considered the same.
Exactly, yeah. So what we talk about is, what leaps out is this is absolute decentralization, right? What the colonists and those who fought in the war believed they were fighting for was a move away from centralized power in the hands of a few, represented by the Crown and the Houses of Commons and Lords and Parliament. And so this is about decentralizing. This is a lot about states' rights. We're hearing that a lot. What you notice is not there's no executive. There's no Supreme Court. There's no standing army. None of the things which we have come to expect are the pillars of the republic that we grew up in. The original vision was, we don't want that centralized authority in the hands of a president or executive, because we saw that what happens with the king. We saw the corruption of the House of Commons and House of Lords. They want to redo this legislature thing, this Congress assembled. There was a Supreme Court in England. It was the King's Bench. There's no mention of that in this governing document. And because one of the grievances that Kai mentioned in the Declaration is about this abuse of military authority that the king did in the colonies, we don't want any part of standing armies. This is a very different kind of governing document. And if you look at the names of the men on page 126, and then you flip back to the names of the men who signed it on page 115, the Declaration, you see some overlap. And I just want to highlight that many of the names you see on those two pages, John Hancock, Samuel Adams, there's two or three I wanted to point out, Benjamin Franklin, the men that we know are famous for signing the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Morris, whether or not they show up as signatories to the Constitution. Because what's happening at the end of the American Revolution and the ratification of the first Constitution is we're now at the bottom of this pull away from centralization and privatization and preemption. That was 1778. 1789, the Constitution, the second Constitution is ratified. 11 years later, we're already snapped back up. As Kai described it, a revolution against the revolution.
Yeah, two more things to point out. As Brad mentioned, on page 122 at the top of the page, you'll see language that reads, Congress by less than 2, no more than 7 members, and no person shall be capable of any delegate for more than 3 years in any term of 6 years. What is that?
Term limits.
So that term limits. And then on 123, Brad mentioned no Supreme Court. At the bottom of the page there under Article 9, I believe it is, where it says the United States and Congress assembled shall also be the last resort on appeal. So basically they didn't have a sitting Supreme Court. It was a matter of if the matter required it, well, they would assemble a special group to basically deal with that last resort of appeal. So they didn't have a standing Supreme Court as eventually the Constitution will have. And we'll see later about what people thought about the idea of the Supreme Court at the time that the Supreme Court was being considered in the way that the Constitution was constructed. And another big thing that's missing from the Articles of Confederation, which very much comes into play about why the Constitution came to be, is there's no commerce clause. So this idea of commerce, commercial activity, wasn't defined as being a power of the United States Congress, that again was still delegated to the individual states to determine, and such that if you wanted to do business, you had to deal with each of the states. And if it just so happened you had business that were, crossed over both states, well, you had to deal with both legislative bodies, that there wasn't a centralized way through the federal government, through something like the Commerce Clause, that would take care of that. And that becomes very important because that's really what got the snowball rolling down the hill through the enterprises of George Washington. Commerce was very much what eventually got people to sit down to consider the Constitution itself. But that's not something of which they wanted to see happen in the Articles of Confederation. And usually if you see articles written about it or people discuss it, They talk about the major defect of the Articles of Confederation about not having that Commerce Clause in it, which is usually what people will say about it, historically speaking, is that's the reason we had to get away from it, because our commercial activities, our commerce wasn't functioning as good as it needed to be because the document didn't address that. And so we needed to correct for that as a reason to come up with the U.S. Constitution.
And to refer back to what Tom said last night, as a document written in the late 1700s, with this vast expanse of land before it, it made sense to write a governing document that facilitated the expansion and vacuuming up of resources at the most accelerated rate. And the governing document here, which doesn't give a mechanism to facilitate that, had to be replaced.
So we're going to take a quick break, but before we do, any questions, thought at this point? I mean, on the timeline here, we've gotten to here. And we're about to move up this chart again. So the up, again, remembering moving back in this direction. So the revolutionary period, the Articles itself, was very much about decentralizing, making sure that people were all, the governing source or the power of government, really moving towards a greater rights orientation. And yet we're going to see how the evolution of the document of the Constitution itself was very much, in a lot of ways, going back to this English common law structure and why that came to be, and then, again, how commerce became such a key element in those discussions, and what the people who were eventually the drafters of the Constitution even thought about democracy, for instance, and how that ordering came to be. In fact, when we hear from the Constitutional Convention itself, it's going to sound very much like Bernays in the start of his book on propaganda, in the sense of how you have to order things in a democratic society was very much the mindset of those who were the major architects of the Constitution.
Did they think this was this generally accepted as being adequate at the time, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
But there wasn't a long period between this document and the U.S. Constitution.
About 10 years.
Yeah.
So pretty short period of time.
I guess I'm struck and disturbed by how much of this sounds like what the Tea Party is trying to tell us we should be devolving to. And I'm just trying to get my head around that.
Shocked that you agree with something.
Well, I didn't say I agreed with it.
Yeah, but you're right.
I'm struck by
That thread of local control and devolving power to the states or the local is one of
states. in the
right.
Tea Party
Exactly.
case.
Right.
And then they of course, they're still asserting that the state should have power.
Right. It's troubling because this rescinding of the Obama protections for transgender kids now becomes not a civil rights issue, but a states' rights issue, right? So the echoes are absolutely troubling. Yeah.
It's co-opting that
Right.
rationale for.
Right. Right.
And then when you consider, as I recognized the other day, that the Montana State Legislature, for example, by their constitution, meets for a total of 90 days every 2 years and discusses during the time they're together whether or not to outlaw Sharia law as an important issue. Where the hell would that leave them?
Right.
Yeah, another thing to throw out is, I think, to think about and maybe hold in your heads as we move is sort of this idea of orders of government, the ordering of government. I mean, we basically have 3 layers: the federal, state, and local. So what should be the relationship, or what is the relationship, which is a lot of what we talk about here. What is that relationship today versus perhaps what could that relationship be between those 3 layers? And associated with that, I think, is this idea of rights. Where do rights come from? Who should have the greatest ability to protect or even advance rights? Right now, everything moves to that federal level. So in essence, you rise or fall based on that structure of whatever that highest level is going to say. And the question is, I think, to ask yourselves, is that adequate? Especially when we see the ability of the federal level to undermine rights, whether it's through bestowing on corporate power, or whether it's about things on this idea of redefining the protections for transgendered people. So I think that's a lot of, what this should be bringing up is, what is that ordering supposed to be? What is the purpose of government? I think, again, when those people during the revolutionary period were talking about, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, well, is that really what, for instance, the Constitution is set up to do or not? And so I think that's all the stuff that kind of gets unpacked during democracy school. Whether it gets resolved for everybody at the end, that's going to be a different story. But I think it's about challenging these notions, or challenging even the idea of what we thought the system should be versus what it could be or needs to be, is really a lot of what hopefully comes out at the end of this school for people. Jim?
I'm kind of curious about that. I realize I got all the way through my civics education without really understanding, where does the term common law derive from? And the notion of the commons runs through all of this. I mean, if you look at it, when you talk about them in the 1600s, 1700s, asserting individual rights, they're always referring back to the common good as a way of, I don't know, a mechanism of enforcement, to preserve their liberty. They go together. I guess, I'm trying to figure out how to describe that. But where does the term common law derive from? Why is it not called property law? Or
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a fusion. It's not just the written law, but also sort of the cultural view and the actions, the societal structures that became sort of under that whole term of English.
So is it
common law.
related to the House of Commons? I mean, is the House of Commons named that also for the same?
Well, I mean, the House of Commons became really that next layer of negotiated power. That became sort of the business sector of the power structure. So you had, the king, and then you had the lords, as they were called, so the aristocracy. And then the House of Commons really became sort of the business interests, at least in the English form of how it got set up, which of course is exactly how we then formulated our own form of government between the Senate and the House, because really the Senate in a lot of ways is the Lords, at least how it was originally conceived, and the Commons was the House of Representatives. But I think, within that is also this question, which we don't dive too deeply into in democracy schools, this sense of property and property rights. Where does that come to be into play?
Between the commons and private property.
Sure, or even just a property-oriented view of how things need to operate, and how does that work in relation to when we're trying to protect ecosystems, for instance, or civil rights, and how is it that our system has gotten to the point where it recognizes, again, property as being paramount to other needs, really, and other really true rights, because really in some ways property rights are property privileges. They're not rights in the same way that we may think of fundamental rights, but we call them property rights, for instance. And so I think that's another thing that eventually probably has to be looked at, is how does the whole idea of property ownership and property rights, when I say property rights, I'm talking about physical land, for instance, and is there a distinction that needs to be made between one owning your house, for instance, versus the property that a corporation owns, for instance, which should be the physical resource they want to extract. The permit itself is property, and so all the various things that go into sort of that property orientation or relationship. There's also other things that I think get stirred up in the democracy schools. Can we continue to have that kind of a system, or even water rights, for instance? Well, in some ways, water rights are really water privileges, and so does that water privilege system work if we're moving into the system where we're not going to really have water like we have had previously? Yeah. Is that going to be an adequate way to look at water protection or true water rights, let's say? I think it starts to, basically lots of things start to spin out of control when you start to actually look at how the system functions to what we really truly need, both as a civil society, let's say, but also just ecologically speaking, what's needed is the way that government operates today, up to the job.